Today we're talking about Impressionist art. Impressionism is today one of the most famous and most widely beloved forms of art, so it's likely you'll have at least seen some of these images and have maybe some familiarity with Impressionism before you come to this class. The Impressionist movement gets its name from this painting, Monet's Impression Sunrise, that he paints in 1872, and is part of the exhibition of the first Impressionist show. The name Impressionism comes from a newspaper review of that first Impressionist show, where art critic Louis Lavoie says that this painting is an impression. Lavoie means this in a decidedly non-complimentary way. He means this as an insult, and he perceives this painting as sloppy and unfinished. But this painting is really at the heart of what the Impressionists are trying to do, and the Impressionists' goals are distinctly different than most of the artists that we've talked about up to this point. First of all, they exhibited their art in a different way. The Impressionist shows were independent shows arranged by the artists themselves, and anybody who wanted to could exhibit. All you had to do was show up and pay your entry fee. This is very different than the way that most artists are exhibiting at this time, which is in those official salons that we've been talking about since the mid-18th century. We see a few artists like Courbet that we mentioned earlier this week who have different ways of showing their art, but often those ways of showing their art lead more to mockery and ridicule than actual successful careers. The Impressionist shows are successful not only in that they're independent, but there's a large number of them. This is not just a one-time event or a one-time happening. The Impressionists take inspiration from the Realists in other ways as well. Like the Realists, they're interested in painting everyday life, but where Realists are interested in capturing a particular scene or a particular event, the Impressionists are often interested in something that's much smaller. We can think of this kind of a way of zooming in on the Realists, but they're trying to capture just a single moment in time. Some of the Impressionists are particularly interested in light and atmosphere, and Monet is probably the most famous of the Impressionist artists for this particular set of interests. We're going to see some of the other interests of the Impressionists in the next slide, and the Impressionists share a generally overlapping set of interests, but some artists feature one interest more heavily, and other artists feature other interests more heavily. So Monet is very interested in this idea of light and atmosphere, and how do we depict light and atmosphere in a relatively flat, two-dimensional work of art on a canvas. And there's several new options that are available to Monet that have not been available to artists before him. One, which we see in this particular painting, is painting what we call en plein air. This is a French phrase that just means outdoors or out of your studio. And because of new technology like the railway, the Impressionists are able to travel far from their studios and far from their homes and visit those places for a couple of days or a weekend, and to take their painting supplies with them. So although Monet primarily lives in Paris, this particular painting shows us the harbor of the French port city of Le Havre. He's also benefited by the fact that art supplies that are fairly recognizable to us were becoming widely available in the last decades of the 19th century. Before the 1800s, artists made virtually all of their own supplies, and as the Industrial Revolution has ramped up over the 1800s, we gradually see more and more art supplies becoming widely available for purchase. So Monet and his contemporaries didn't have to grind their own pigments and mix their own paints. They are able, just like we are today, to go to a store and to buy a tube of paint. Importantly, these tubes of paint had a tin screw top, very much like we would think of like a toothpaste tube today. And this lets them squeeze out enough paint to use at one time, and then close the tube back up, and that paint will stay soft and pliable until the next time you're ready to use it. Monet was also a particularly keen observer of the effects of light and atmosphere. And in many of his paintings, it's those effects of light, weather, and atmosphere that are the real subject matter, not whatever is in front of him. And Monet would often work on a large number of paintings at the same time. He also often worked in large series, painting a similar, or in some cases identical, scene over and over again. For instance, in his famous water lily paintings, there's more than 100 paintings of the water lilies, and there's about 40 of these paintings of Rouen Cathedral. But what's really being depicted here is the ideas of light and shadow and atmosphere. How does this monumental building, that is beautiful in its own right, but is not really the subject here, how does that look at different times of day, under different weather conditions, at different periods? And Monet might paint on one painting for as little as 5 minutes before switching over and considering the light to have changed too much to continue working on that same painting. So in these paintings, as well as in the Impression Sunrise, we really see that interest in light and atmosphere. That's an important part of the Impressionist movement.